I wanted to use this initial talk just to say something in a very brief and broad brush way, just to contextualize this conference and its themes. And I'm hoping that this will kind of link up with the round table at the end of the conference that Lina Bolzoni has kindly agreed to chair, so that we'll kind of frame the conference with this ongoing discussion about the state of studies of Vittoria Colonna today. I wanted to start off with some acknowledgements, though. I think whatever the academic merits of a conference, I do think conferences are only as good as their organization. And I've been lucky enough to benefit from a completely exceptional level of support here at La Pietra. Where the academic side is concerned, I've worked successively with Claudia Tarallo and Alice Fischetti, and both have done a wonderful job in liaising with speakers. Millie Papworth from Cambridge has also been a very welcome addition to the team in the final stages. In terms of the more kind of purely logistic business, accommodation, catering, travel bookings, technology, publicity, I have a huge debt to Lucia Ferroni, who's just come in through the door, who's done an amazing job at coordinating the organization of the conference. And I'd also like to thank Maria Mihailovic, Cristina Fantacci, and Luca Ragazzo, and Domenico Canalire. I'd also like to thank Paul Green for the poster design, and Cristina Bellini, our librarian, for pulling together our little book display outside, which contains some historical works from the Acton collection in this kind of area, as well as recent publications. Where funding is concerned, I'd like to thank the Provost's Global Research Initiative at NYU and the Office of Global Programs. And I'd like to thank all our speakers and chairs, many of whom among the speakers have come very long distances for this conference. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone who's come here to listen this morning, and I hope also to participate in the discussion. I've scheduled in quite a lot of kind of extra time, odd half hours here and there between sessions, and I'm hoping this will be a very kind of talky conference, where the discussions, have as much weight almost as the official sessions. I also wanted to take this chance just to mark one significant absence. I'm very sorry that Tatiana Crivelli, who was one of the first people I invited to this conference and who accepted with great enthusiasm, is very unfortunately not able to be with us today, and she'll be very much missed. So something about the genesis of this conference. I first thought of the idea of this conference as a way of celebrating the appearance last year of two important publications on Vittoria Colonna, both of which you can see outside in the book display. The Brill, Companion to Vittoria Colonna, edited by Abigail Brandin, Serena Sapegno, and Tatiana Crivelli, and the Viella volume Vittoria Colonna al crocevia della storia, edited by Serena Sapegno. It's not every year that you see two major publications on Vittoria Colonna. So thinking about those two publications, and a third, which is still in progress and eagerly awaited, Ramie Targoff's new biography of Colonna, which we'll hear a foretaste of in our opening session, it seemed to me that Vittoria Colonna was having a kind of moment, and I wanted to pick up on that momentum and see whether we could carry it forward with this conference. So what I'd like to do now in this opening talk is give a kind of situation report or snapshot of the state of studies in this area, or how I see the state of studies in this area. It'll be quite a kind of personal view. Just by way of backdrop to this talk, I'm going to be showing a series of portrait medals of Colonna from the 16th century, which I did some work on recently in a piece that appeared in the Brill volume and the Viella volume, and which I think are fascinating documents of her image and her impact. I just wanted to kind of throw them into the visual mix of this conference. I'm not going to speak about them. So Vittoria Colonna has a very unusual history for an early modern woman writer. She was famous during her lifetime, and she immediately became part of the canon in ways that I think we'll talk about during this conference. And she hasn't really disappeared from the canon since. So when I say she's having a moment, I don't mean it's any kind of rediscovery. I don't think she's ever gone away. I think there's always been a decent level of critical attention given to her. But I think the claim I'd like to make is that recent critical trends and developments have given us new ways to frame her life and work, with the result that Colonna is looking more interesting and fresh and more historically significant than she has for a very long time. So what are these trends and developments I'm talking about? One is just a kind of negative one. I think across the last 3 decades or so, since I was a student in the early 1980s, we've gradually shaken off the last remnants of various critical legacies from the 19th and early 20th century, which impeded a proper appreciation of Colonna's verse. First, just that whole stereotype of Petrarchism as derivative and inauthentic and hardly deserving of serious critical scrutiny. And also, more specifically, the prescriptive notion of what women's writing ought to look like, encapsulated in Croce's formula of letteratura femminile, which was looking to women for a kind of quasi-naive, sort of impassioned outpouring of feeling. And that wasn't a formula which fitted Colonna's verse particularly well, and I think it did quite a lot to depress critical estimates of her in the 20th century. I think we now tend to see Petrarchist verse by both male and female poets in a more sympathetic and historicizing way. We come to the lyric poetry of the time with a more interesting set of questions, I think, questions about the ways in which this seemingly highly codified and uniform language could be bent to particular poets' social and cultural and literary and even political agendas. And also questions about how this poetry was concretely produced and circulated and how it was read and recited and generally sort of put to use in the world. So I think those developments have benefited Vittoria Colonna as well as other poets of the era. To take the last line of inquiry I was just talking about, I think she's benefited from the current fascination with the material circulation of texts and the relationship between print and manuscript culture and between elite and popular print culture. The extreme complexity and intricacy of the history of the transmission of her verse, which makes her something of a nightmare for prospective editors, actually makes her a very fascinating case study for anyone interested in the dynamics of reception and circulation at this time, as the opening section in the Brill Companion very richly demonstrates, and as our sessions tomorrow with Abigail Brundin and Umberto Gonzalez will further explore. Another critical tendency that's hugely benefited studies of Colonna is the vast surge of interest over the same kind of period, the last 3 decades or so, in women's social role and cultural contribution, which we've seen really in all humanities fields. I think we've seen this trend to a limited extent within the Italian tradition of scholarship, but far more elsewhere, and perhaps especially in the English-speaking academic world, and we may want to discuss that geographic discrepancy in the concluding roundtable of the conference. So over the past 3 decades or so, there's been a massive kind of collective work of rediscovery of women's writing from this period, which I think has been really quite transformative of our understanding of that tradition. Summarizing very briefly, it's emerged that there was a far stronger tradition of writing by women, and especially published writing by women, than has often been thought in the past. And it was much more durable over time than has often been thought, lasting right through the later 16th century. And in fact, reaching some kind of peak of intensity during the decades from 1580 to 1610. I document this in the appendices of my 2008 book, Women's Writing in Italy, 1400 to 1650. I don't know whether you can read the small print here, but I'm showing you here a page from that appendix documenting published writings by women in the decade from 1588 to 1597. So you can see there's a fair amount. Although Italy was highly precocious in this regard, scholars working on other European literary traditions have similarly documented the emergence of a tradition of women's writing between the 16th and 17th centuries, mainly the 17th century outside Italy. So I think we now have a much richer and fuller picture of the extent and the ways in which women participated in literary production through this whole period right across Europe. So that's the kind of thing I meant when I said earlier, when I talked earlier about how recent critical trends and developments have given us new ways to frame Colonna's life and work. I think there was a tendency throughout much of the 20th century to think of women writers in Italy as a feature of a brief, intense season concentrated around the middle of the 16th century in the 1540s and 50s, with a few kind of isolated outliers like Veronica Franco later in the century. Within that limited historical time frame, Vittoria Colonna's importance was already very clear. She was the first identified woman poet whose work appeared in print, and the success of her work encouraged publishers to seek out and publish other women writers. But I think now we can see the longer picture. Colonna's importance appears even more clearly. She really is the key prototype and inspiration for later Italian women writers in ways that we can trace in a very detailed way at a textual level. Two of the works by women on the page I was just showing, Maddalena Campiglia's pastoral drama Flori and Francesca Turina's Rime Spirituali, contain explicit tributes to Vittoria Colonna. And this isn't just the case with the 16th century. We can see the same in the 18th century as well, the age of Arcadia, as Adriana Camello and Tatiana Crivelli have shown. Just to illustrate this point about Colonna's later influence, I wanted to show you this late medal of her from the 1580s or 90s, which it's been conjectured was produced on a kind of commercial speculative basis for sale. And it's also been pointed out that the rather curious hairdo with this sort of top knot echoes the figure of Sappho in Raphael's Parnassus. So she does really seem to be being portrayed there as precisely the kind of archetype of the female poet. So I've been talking about the growing interest in women and women's contribution within literary studies, but the same point could be made about history. There's been a lot of really excellent work recently by historians, both in Italy and outside Italy, on the relationship between women and political power. And I think that could prove very fruitful in the case of Colonna. I think we have much finer instruments for kind of gauging and talking about this than we had in the past. There's an excellent essay by Marina D'Amelia in the recent Biella collection looking at Vittoria Colonna's relationship with her powerful family and her male relatives and the extent of her influence within the Colonna family. And I think there's more work of that kind that could be very usefully done. So returning to literary studies, another recent development of great relevance to Colonna is the increasing attention that we've seen in recent decades to the sacred literature of the second half of the 16th century, which was until recently almost a kind of no man's land within the Italian critical tradition. Just no one went there at all. I'm illustrating this with another medal, a medal of Gabriele Fiamma, one of the greatest religious poets and the greatest theorist of religious poetry of the later 16th century. I love this medal. I like the kind of skull accessory, de rigueur in the Counter-Reformation. So this new interest in later 16th century religious literature really just dates from, I would say, the past, almost since the turn of the millennium. It was given huge momentum by Amadeo Quondam's bibliographical studies on the 16th century tradition of religious literature in general. We'll have a sample of this new work with Andrea Torres' paper tomorrow on the mysterious and long-forgotten later 16th century poet Lucia Colau. So the importance of this development for Colonna is again to reveal her importance as model and prototype, and this time not just for later women writers, but for male writers as well. I'm thinking especially now of Colonna's standing within the tradition of Petrarchizing religious verse represented by Fiamma, which did become one of the dominant lyric subgenres of the later Cinquecento. She's one of the founders of this tradition, really, along with Girolamo Malipiero. And Fiamma acknowledges this priority in the preface to his important Rime Spirituali of 1570, saying that it's well known that Colonna was la prima che ha cominciato a scrivere con dignità in rime le cose spirituali. Another much practiced 16th century subgenre of lyric, for which Colonna has a decent claim to stand as a key formative figure, if not the complete kind of progenitor of the tradition, is the tradition of marital love poetry, which Shannon McHugh will be talking about tomorrow. Although this never supplanted the earlier Petrarchan model of love poetry addressed to unattainable love objects, verse addressed to spouses, male and female, and also to other family members, did become a significant presence within later 16th century collections, and Colonna can certainly be seen as an influence in this regard. So this process of rehabilitation and reincorporation within the critical tradition of the literature of the later 16th century is kind of only just underway, and it hasn't really spread much outside specialist circles. But I think that once it does, once it reaches the level of kind of manuals, I think Colonna will emerge from her poetic position as one of a group of talented Petrarchist lyricists of the 1530s and 40s, standing out for her gender more than anything. And I think she'll come to see more of a pivotal and transitional figure between the mid-16th century and the later 16th century, and as an innovator as much as an imitator, as she's often tended to be positioned in the past. And I think we shouldn't really underestimate the importance of this within the history of Italian literature. Generally, if you work on English literature or French literature, you're used to thinking about the fundamental role that female authors played in the early development of the novel. But it's kind of hard within the Italian tradition to think of literary forms or genres practiced by both male and female writers, where women have been recognized as among the progenitors of major traditions rather than as imitators or followers. The only instance I can really think of is that of medieval mystical writing, where women had a key role in shaping the tradition. And I think it'll be very interesting in that context to hear Un Falkheid talking about Bridget of Sweden in the context of our discussion of Colonna. I think we may see some interesting parallels. Okay, so I've been deliberately emphasizing the kind of newer elements within the tradition of Italian literary studies, which can help us reframe the figure of Vittoria Colonna. But obviously, I don't want to ignore other more traditional contextualizations or frames. Interest in the Italian reform movement is hardly new. Canti Mori's Eretici Italiani del Cinquecento was published almost 80 years ago. But this tradition of studies has continued to develop and to move beyond religious studies proper to influence fields such as literary history and art history. And many protagonists of that development are here in this room. Yeah, I think the reform context remains a very, very powerful frame for our understanding of Colonna's spirituality and her writings, and for the cultural production of her circles generally. And a number of the papers at this conference, I think, will attest to that, both the art history panel tomorrow, which I think will be very much focused on those issues, and also the biographical and the literary panels today. Yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to say in terms of this kind of snapshot of the current state of the field. As will be clear from what I've been saying, I think studies of Vittoria Colonna find themselves at a propitious and exciting and fertile moment, and I'm sure this conference will reflect that. Just one final closing consideration. In 30 years' time, in 2047, it seems likely that some of the younger participants, at least at this conference, may be gathering somewhere in a more grizzled form to celebrate the 500th anniversary of Colonna's death in 1547. I'm wondering whether it's too much to hope for to think that by that point it may be possible for a reader to wander into an Italian bookshop or a virtual bookshop or whatever kind of future bookshop we have at that point and actually find an edition of Colonna's verse. And who knows, since we're in the realm of futurist fantasy, maybe even an edition of her letters and her Pianto sulla Passione di Cristo as well. Both Tatiana Crivelli in the Brill volume and Serena Sapegno in the introduction to the Viella volume have called attention to the lack of an accessible, up-to-date Italian edition of the Ramie. And this is what you find if you search for Vittoria Colonna Ramie on Amazon Italia. Currently, I've helpfully added the dates of first publication of these works on the right. Right, they all look like kind of attractive, newly published paperbacks. Buyer beware. So we're rather luckier in English, where we have Abby Brandin's edition of Vittoria Colonna's gift manuscript for Michelangelo in the Other Voice series, and Ramie Targoff as well. I think this may be breaking news, is going to edit Colonna's verse for her husband in the same series. So I think this is important because if we're thinking about an author's standing within the canon, academic reputation and interest can't be the only test. I mean, literature exists to be read, and not only by scholars. And I think it needs to catch the attention of students who are not going to go on and do PhDs in the field. And obviously, editions, user-friendly, commented paperback editions, are completely vital to that process. I have a kind of sense, and again, this might be something we want to pick up in the concluding discussion. I have a sense that the women writers of the Renaissance in Italy are of interest to general readers in Italy and elsewhere, perhaps more than to many professional academics. And I'm not sure that that kind of general reader interest is really being fully met at the moment. So on this subject of outreach, I was going to kind of conclude this talk in a rather kind of meandering and inconclusive fashion, but Fortuna handed me a better ending. I went back from dinner last night and checked my email, and I found a message from a director of a recent film on Vittoria Colonna. Has anyone seen this? You come across it? Festina Lente. And she very kindly sent me a trailer, which I thought I would conclude by showing you. It seems the kind of perfect transition between this introduction and the biographical session that will follow.
Ci sono notizie?
Ci sono notizie, ma non quelle che vorreste.
È il marchio di bottega di Aldo Manuzio, con il delfino e l'ancora. Guarda, il delfino evoca la velocità, mentre l'ancora significa stabilità. Aldo è un uomo straordinario, pieno di grande intuizione.
Occorrono 6 giorni per trasformare un cencio in un foglio di carta.
Ho ideato un sistema di simboli da nascondere nella carta delle vostre lettere.
Sono le vostre rime, sì o no?
Si sono addensate nubi che oscurano la verità e la giustizia.
Non c'è dubbio, voi siete la marchesa Colonna. Ho visto il ritratto che ha fatto il mio amico Sebastiano del Piombo.
vostro marito ha battuto i francesi a Pavia. È un eroe.
Vittoria, non ti tormentare.
È pure un inchiostro il prezioso sangue.
No, Vittoria!
Chiunque sappia tenere una penna in mano è considerato un nemico.
Non fatevi trovare, fuggite dal giardino. Presto, venite.
Sono nato a Fabriano e ho lavorato nella stamperia di Aldo Manuzio fino alla sua morte.
È inaccettabile.
Per me sono dei maiali posseduti dal demonio.
Questo laico, che si copre d'oro dalla testa ai piedi, presto sarà preso d'assedio.
Roma è ipocrita e autoritaria, Ascanio, ma non credere di essere da meno. Da domani niente più combattimenti a Ischia. Con largo volo, per cammin sicuro, cercai d'alzarmi anch'io con queste piume.
Dominus vobiscum.
Gentiluomini e gentildonne, festina lente. Affrittati, adagio. Aldo Manuzio sarebbe fiero di te.
Qui sorgerà la cupola di San Pietro, che io ho progettato.
Dio alla grande potessa di non immischiarsi nelle cose della corte di Roma.
So there you go. If I'd known a little more in advance, I could have organized a screening as part of this conference. Let the proceedings begin. Could I ask... So I'm just going to very briefly introduce our chair and then leave him to it. Among the many very good ideas that the organizers of this conference had was to provide a full printout of all the biographies of the speakers and chairs, which I think is rather nice because it means we can use a slightly lighter touch in introducing everyone and not feel the need to read through the entire thing. I hope everyone has a copy of this. So I'll just say very briefly that I'm delighted to introduce my colleague Matteo Duni, who is our Renaissance history expert here at medieval and Renaissance history expert here at NYU Florence. Matteo teaches courses on early modern religion and magic. He has a real specialism in witches, and I was trying to think of some clever and witty sort of connection with Vittoria Colonna, but I just don't think I'm going to go there. So Matteo received his PhD in History and Civilization from the European University Institute, just up the road, in 1999. His publications include Tra religione e magia, storia del prete modenese Guglielmo Campana, and published by Olsky in 1999, and Under the Devil's Spell, Witches, Sorcerers, and the Inquisition in Renaissance Italy, published by Syracuse University in 2007. And you have the remainder of his publications.
Thank you very much, Virginia, for this kind introduction, and for having asked me to chair this session. It's very exciting for me to return to hearing about Vittoria Colonna, a woman in a period of in history that I actually began studying a long time ago at the University of Florence with my maestro Antonio Rotondo, who was, in fact, a specialist of 16th century Italian Reformation, and especially heresy. And so it's a pleasure to return to those themes and to a woman that, as you said, from many points of view, was a sort of crossroads of many, many themes and many issues that 16th century Italians were discussing. So I'll just hand the microphone to Shulamit Fustemberg-Levi, who's an independent scholar that has received her PhD from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and teaches courses on Italian Jewish history at the International Studies Institute at Palazzo Rucellai and at the Overseas School at Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence. She's the author of the Accademia Pontaniana, Model of a Humanist Network, published by Brill in 2016. It's a very interesting year for these topics. And her paper is on the Davalos Colonna Literary Circle, a renewed Parnassus.
During the first decade of the 16th century, a period of political and religious turmoil in Italy, two women, Costanza d'Avalos, the chatelaine of the castle of Ischia, together with her niece by marriage, Vittoria Colonna, hosted literary gatherings in Ischia. Here we see a kind of graphical representation of both women in an altarpiece painting of the Madonna delle Grazie, now in the convent of Sant'Antonio di Padova. Okay, Vittoria Colonna and Costanza d'Avalos, who was recently widowed. I would like to point out that Diana Rabin, in her excellent book, Publishing Women, Salons, the Presses, and the Counter-Reformation in the 16th Century Italy, denotes the term salon to the gathering on Ischia. In order, I believe, to differentiate between the all-masculine meetings and these which were hosted and organized by women, and perhaps in order to indicate it as a forerunner of the later salons. I have chosen, though, to stick to the Italian term cenacolo, circle, which was used at the time in order to emphasize the idea of continuity between the humanist cenacoli. In this difficult task of differentiation between the various types of gatherings, sodalities, academies, circles, we should point out to the methodological difficulties that one comes across in the study of informal groups. While the study of more formal academies that spread all over Italy in the 16th century is supported by formal documents, including lists of members, written constitutions, and written records, atti, research on the cenacoli and on what one might call the early academies must be based primarily on literary sources and letters. It is interesting to note that scholarship has acknowledged the existence of the d'Avalos Colonna circle to a large extent through the research of women scholars in the course of the past century. Among them, in particular, Amalia Giordano in 1906, Suzanne Therold in 1968, and Diana Rabin in 2007. Amalia Giordano established then the division of the d'Avalos Colonna's cenacolo into four periods. The first between 1509 and 1512, in which Sannazaro, Cariteo, and a few other poets participated. The second, 1517 to 1525, in which Galeazzo di Tarzia, il Britonio, il Capagno. The third, 1527 to 2028, in which appear the two Anisios, Paolo Giovio, Marcantonio Minturno, and Flaminio, and the last period, 1533 to 1536, in which Vittoria Colonna is surrounded by Bernardo Tasso, Luigi Tansillo, Angelo di Costanzo, and Berardino Rota. This is a basic division which is also discussed. Not everything is accepted by scholars afterwards, but I would say that becomes the basis of how the cenacolo is described. Until recent years, the Ischien cenacolo has been investigated almost only in the framework of the studies on Vittoria Colonna's intellectual and spiritual milieu. Only recently have there been written studies in which the focus of interest has been shifted to the sodality itself. The starting point of my talk today is with Girolamo Britonio, one of the participants in the d'Avalos Colonna Circle and a member of the Neapolitan Accademia Pontaniana. The Accademia Pontaniana was a sodality of intellectuals that flourished towards the end of the 15th century. Its founder, the humanist Pontano, who lived between 1429 and 1503, was born in the Umbrian town of Cerreto and came to Naples in 1448 under the patronage of the King of Naples, Alfonso of Aragon. With the fall of the Aragonese rule and the death of Pontano, the Accademia Pontaniana entered a new phase. Although all members of the original academy mourn together the death of Pontano, and much of their activity is accompanied by a strong sense of nostalgia for the original academy, a new divided actuality comes into view in which some of the members are in exile and others continue in intellectual activity in the Neapolitan Accademia Pontaniana. At this point, new intellectual realities emerge in southern Italy, led or supported by previous members of the Accademia Pontaniana, whose intense experience of the conversations and of the participation of the collectivity and the participation of texts for publication, which had taken place in their home academy, has now motivated them to transfer this experience to a different parallel form or location. Girolamo Britonio, in his work La gelosia del sole, which he dedicated to Vittoria Colonna and published in Naples in 1519, addresses Pietro Gravina, a central member of the Accademia Pontaniana, and incites him to go to Ischia, where the water is clear, where he should tell Vittoria that she has made from the mountain a new Parnassus for us. The poem seems to indicate that the construction of a renewed Parnassus is a reaction to the destruction of the institutions of the Aragonese period and to the longing for the Pontaniana Academy. We read further in his poem, "Your sacred lyre, Apollo, had value while the Aragonese dynasty glowed. O lucky Pontano, Sanazzaro, and Albino, Altilio, and Cariteo, with the many others who lived singing in indeed good times." We can relate to the image of clear water as well as physical, as allegorical as well as physical. On the one hand, Ischia can be viewed as an island disconnected from the brutal reality of the peninsula. Britannia may be indicating that clear water, a place that has not been contaminated by war, is found on the island of Ischia. Ischia was in fact known to have served as a refuge from various catastrophes, plague, destruction, and war. And indeed, some of the participants in the Cenacolo were fleeing misfortune. For some of the participants coming from Rome, such as Paolo Giobio, Ischia was an asylum from the sack of Rome. Ischia was considered a sort of Arcadio for them, a place far from politics and conflict, clear water. On the other hand, Ischia can be viewed in its geocultural context, located in the Bay of Naples, right across from Naples. Although the literary circle hosted intellectuals from a variety of places, we can detect a certain dialogue, echo between these two centers. The clear water in this case can be alluding to a renewal of the original circle of intellectuals around Pontano. Pontano himself, in his collection of joyful erotic poems, his Baiai, published in 1505, makes some connection between the water of the Bay of Naples and Pontano's circle. In many of these poems, the Academy members are mentioned while bathing in thermal waters, drinking wine, and speaking of women in erotica. In this context, we even find the participation of women. For example, in Baiai 110, Pontano invites his friends, Albino, Calenzio, Compatre, Altilio, and Marulus, to party in celebration of the return to Naples of their common friend, Marchese, at which they will drink and dance, each man enjoying the company of two women. Perhaps Britonio is indicating here that the renewed academy has moved now to Ischia. This can be seen as the point of view of a young poet connected to the post-Pontano's Accademia Pontaniana, which, as I already mentioned, cultivated the nostalgia regarding the original Accademia Pontaniana during the Aragonese period, when Pontano was the head of the academy. Interestingly, the idea of a connection between Pontano's circle and Ischia existed in the memory of the 16th and 17th century Neapolitan intellectuals. We know that in 1473, while Pontano was on the island of Ischia for an official role, he bought a villa with a fruit garden in which there was a spring with thermal water. We find documents that show that in 1497 he gave the villa to his servant Jacopo Ferrara as a sign of gratitude, with the request that the villa keep the name Pontano. We do not know of any 15th century sources that make reference to social or intellectual gatherings that took place on the grounds of this villa on Ischia during Pontano's lifetime. The situation is different when it comes to later sources. For example, in a 16th century scientific work of the Neapolitan filosofo e medico Giulio Iasolino, we find various references to Pontano's villa, among them following. Between the city of Ischia and the famous garden and grand and beautiful cenacolo of the learned and singular Pontano, there is a third of a mile. This is only one of the descriptions in this book. And then he continues to describe the spring in the garden and its clear and sweet water. We assume that when Iasolino relates to the garden connected to Pontano's villa in terms of a cenacolo, he also has in mind the gatherings that took place in Ischia after Pontano's death, organized by Vittoria Colonna, in which various accademici pontaniani participated. In fact, while poets from various circles were invited to take part in these gatherings, many of the participants were members of various phases of the Accademia Pontaniana, such as Sanazzaro, Cariteo, Gravina, Antonio Minturno, and Scipione Capece. The members of the early period surely experienced a sense of continuity with Accademia Pontaniana. They were accustomed to a similar structure of gatherings based on writing, reading out loud of text, and discussions. They read aloud their manuscripts to the other humanists, basically preparing the final draft of their text. They discussed and analyzed both ancient as well as modern texts. Here, for example, we can draw a connecting line between the image of Pontano reading aloud his Urania at the Accademia Pontaniana in Naples and that described by various scholars of Sanazzaro reading from his masterpiece, the Arcadio, at the Davalos Colonna gathering. Or of Paolo Giovio's dialogue, notable men and women of our time being read out loud, as he himself describes in his letters, and discussions around his text with the active participation of Vittoria Colonna. On Ischia, a meeting place between poets from Rome and Naples, we also find conversations taking place, for example, between Giovio and Sanazzaro on Pontano's work De Bello Neapolitano. In that way, continuing a theme that interests the post-Pontano accademici pontaniani. Giovio's dialogue, notable men and women of our time, which is set on Ischia, mirrors the impact that the Pontaniani members had on the Davalos Colonna circle. Pontano has a prominent place in the dialogue. In various moments throughout the discussions, when mentioning subjects such as astrology, eloquence, reference is made to Pontano. In addition, the dialogue alludes to the impact that Pontano had on the intellectuals on Ischia through his statue there. Pontano is not only mentioned or indicated, some of his attitudes are echoed in Giovio's dialogue. For example, an important characteristic of Pontano, which seems to have penetrated into Giovio's dialogue, especially into the third book, is the importance he placed upon humor. Yet while Pontano assigns his ideal only to men, in the third book of the dialogue, which discusses illustrious women, we see how the ideal of Facezia is applied to women as well. And since she has ears that are neither gloomy nor severe, she takes pleasure in her own wit and in jokes of others. In fact, the figure of Costanza Davalos appears to fit this description. We hear of the humorous, sharp answer she gives when asked what she thought of Diomedes' Magnificus Aedes, magnificent palace and collection, and she answered, I would say mockingly, that they taste like aspen. And to get back to Giovio's dialogue, in the second book of the dialogue, which catalogs approximately 150 literati, we find a paragraph relating to the following Neapolitan humanists: Pietro Gravina, Carbone. I won't go into the whole list. It seems like Giovio chose those academici Pontagnani who also frequented the Ischien circle, thus creating an identification between the two circles. In addition, two other Pontagnana members are referred to in Giovio's dialogue. Britonio and Sanazzaro was considered the most important contemporary poet. They are called by the Neapolitan Muscetola, who was on Ischia during the period in which Giovio wrote the dialogue, our Britonio and our Sanazzaro, or our friend Sanazzaro. One which wonders if this our refers to Naples or to Ischia. I should mention that for some scholars of Vittoria Colonna, the main point of convergence between the Accademia Pontagnana and the Davalos Colonna circle lies in common religious thought. Scholars such as Abigail Brandon have pointed to literati such as Sanazzaro and later Scipione Capece as responsible for having introduced Vittoria Colonna to a certain kind of mystical reforming spirituality. This reforming spirituality attributed to the Accademia Pontagnana should, in my view, be seen as the post-Pontano characteristic, perhaps a liberation from a Pontagnana spirit developed also as a result of the strong links created with the Ischien circle. Another important link that we find between the two intellectual circles is the central role played by the head of the cenacolo. For the humanistic academies, the head of the academy had a crucial role. For example, while the later academies defined their main focus or philosophy through the condensation into a motto and an impresa, in the early academies, the role played by the figure of Pontano, for example, as a leader of great initiative, was of crucial importance. The members of Pontano's academy defined themselves to a large extent through the figure of Pontano. In fact, there are some interesting similarities between the figure of Pontano as the head of the Accademia Pontagnana and the figure of Vittoria Colonna that should be pointed out. Both of them are part of a cult of fame, very developed during the Renaissance. And here I'm going to be. Here we see the medals, which I call as the currency of fame. We can see Pontano on one side and his Urania on the other side. Whereas one example of Vittoria Colonna's medal, Vittoria Colonna, and the Phoenix, again, an important theme of her poetry. Pontano's Urania, the poem most admired by his contemporaries, ends with an explicit expression of his desire for fame. Fame herself present at my funeral in golden dress, with her great mouth and her great voice and her great wings throughout the nations far and wide. She will make my name known to great applause, and she will carry my reputation down through the centuries, and the winds will clap their hands, echoing my praises. Vittoria Colonna, who relates often in her poems to the fame of her husband, was known to have herself won the highest fame in the study of letters. Ariosto, as you all know, in his 37th canto of his Orlando Furioso, dedicates a long paragraph to her. He first relates to her poetry. This one woman has not only made herself immortal with a style, a sweetness I have never heard bettered, and then Vittoria is her name, appropriate for one born amid victories. These are only a few out of many tributes written in honor of Vittoria Colonna. But most of all, Pontano and Vittoria Colonna are praised specifically for their ability to combine excellence as a poet and at the same time being completely involved in political affairs. On Vittoria Colonna's bravura in the public realm, Paolo Giovio elaborates when describing her success when Pope Clement entrusted the city of Benevento to her. The entire populace, deeply moved by the moderation of her highly authoritative and absolutely incorruptible character, gave thanks to the pontiff through ambassadors, because at the last minute, through this woman, Better than any male governor, he had saved the city as it was collapsed. Lelio Gregorio Giraldi, in his work Modern Poets, describes Pontano as one of the leading poets, just about equal to all writers of antiquity, who at the same time is involved in the important affair of kings and princes, who handled terms and treatises pertaining to both war and peace. It seems that the combining of these two aspects, vita attiva and vita contemplativa, if you'd like, form a convincing ideal model of a leader which attracted poets. We see here that the function of the head of the academy was not one of a mere organizer or initiator, but one who inspired. Yet we should point out to the difference between the two. During Pontano's period, he functioned as an only head of the academy. After Pontano's death, during the first decades of the 16th century, we will find that the Academy's meetings do not center around one person in the same way as they did around him. Often we will find a division between the host, who is defined the head, and who is defined the head of the Academy. For example, while Sanazzaro hosted the Academy meetings, Sumonte functioned more as the leader figure. So is the case in the Ischien circle. We find an impressive collaboration between two women, the intellectual hostess, Costanza Dabalos, and the famous head of the circle, Vittoria Colonna. Despite the strong connections between the two circles, the Accademia Pontaniana and the Dabalos Colonna circle, in which factors such as geographical vicinity, common members, etc., play a significant role, we shouldn't forget other models which contributed to the shaping of the Dabalos Colonna's image of a sodality, such as that of Castiglione. Vittoria Colonna was familiar with Castiglione's Il Libro del Cortegiano from correspondences with him, which is especially famous for his accusation of her for allowing the manuscript that he confided to her to circulate against his request. We also learned that she had a very high opinion of it. The Ischien literary circle surely offered a new model different than the Pontaniana and that of differently than the Pontaniana. One of its focuses is on writing, reading, and discussing literary works written also in the vernacular. But the main innovation is the feminine profile of the gathering, created by the women who not only hosted and ran gatherings of men, but shaped and molded the gatherings as well as the literary works that were produced around these gatherings. From the many references made to Vittoria Colonna by Accademia Pontaniana members, we can infer that if not for the policy of the male-centered humanist academies, Vittoria Colonna would have been a natural member of this group. Our knowledge of the participants of the Accademia Pontaniana's members and of the activity during the first decades of the 16th century is extracted from lists of names and descriptions integrated into the literary works which were produced by its members. Vittoria Colonna is not mentioned in these descriptions. It seems that in this moment of history, women such as Vittoria Colonna had to be the initiators, hostesses of a gathering, not only a participant, in order to be documented as being there. The situation changes in the second half of the 16th century with the more formal academies, as Virginia Cox in her chapter on women in academies shows clearly. I would like to suggest, it's a very speculative suggestion, but that not all participants in an intellectual gathering had the privilege to be mentioned in written sources. This means that we can use the humanist sources as a basis for positive deduction and learn from it that a certain poet or humanist did participate, but we cannot claim that somebody did not participate just on the basis of his or her not being mentioned in these written sources. From previous research, I reached this conclusion also in relationship to Jewish intellectuals who were in Naples during the last decades of the 15th century and who were surely connected to the Pontaniana milieu, but their name is not mentioned. To conclude, we can say that not only can we learn more about the Dabalos Colonna circle through a deep examination of the Accademia Pontaniana, but also our understanding of the Accademia Pontaniana is enriched by our knowledge of the Eastern Circle.
Thank you much to Shulamit for having followed the thread that connects but also divides the two academies. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ramie Targoff, who is professor of English at Brandeis University, where she's also co-chair of Italian Studies and director of the Mandel Center for the Humanities. She's the author of 3 monographs: Common Prayer, published by University of Chicago Press in 2001, John Donne, Body and Soul, Chicago 2008, and Posthumous Love, Eros and the Afterlife in Renaissance England. I could go on for a long time to actually list her publications. I'll just mention the forthcoming monograph on actually the biography of Vittoria Colonna, Renaissance Woman, The Extraordinary Life and World of Vittoria Colonna, that will be published by Farrar, Strauss, and Giroux in the winter of 2018. The title of her paper is Late Love, Vittoria Colonna and Reginald Pole. Ramie Targoff.
Thank you. I just want to begin by thanking Virginia Cox for having me here and for organizing this wonderful conference, and to Alice and Lucia for all their help in getting us here. In the spring of 1541, after roughly 2 months of intense fighting in the conflict that came to be known as the Salt Wars, Vittoria Colonna's brother Ascanio surrendered to Pope Paul III. Despite fervent pleas from the Emperor Charles V to spare at least a few of the Colonna's feudal properties, Paul razed the fortifications of Marino, Rocca di Papa, and Pagliano to the ground. Ascanio Colonna was declared an enemy of the Papal States and went into exile in the Kingdom of Naples, while Vittoria, who had taken refuge in Orvieto, returned to Rome to the familiar convent of San Silvestro in Capite. Of her response to the Colonna family's ruin, only 2 short traces remain. The first, rather splendid remark, I think, comes secondhand in a letter from the governor of Orvieto, Bruno Monte di Rossi. He was writing throughout the conflict, spying on her, in fact, in Orvieto. He was sent a letter to the Pope's grandson, Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. And by the way, on your handout, I've given the Italian text for which I'm going to be reading my English translation. So this is the first passage. Great satisfaction, De Rossi wrote, is universally felt at the taking of Pagliano, which I immediately made known and published everywhere. Nor did I fail to report the news to the Signora Marchesa, who replied, and this is what I think is one of her wonderful statements, she replied, possessions come and go so long as people are safe. La roba va e viene perché siano salve le persone. The second reference to the family's loss comes in a letter Vittoria wrote to her close friend, Ercole II d'Este in Ferrara. This is the Italian, is the second passage. Your Excellence should know, she began, that I am most consoled in my distress, and I thank God that with the loss of worldly goods, fortune has given me the occasion to acquire goods of the spirit. It was precisely in the aftermath of these worldly losses and their reinforcement of Vittoria's already fierce commitment to the beni dell'animo, as she calls it in the letter to Ercole, it was precisely in the aftermath of these losses that she made the decision to move to Viterbo, where a community of reformers was gathering around the newly appointed papal legate, or governor, Reginald Pole. My talk today focuses on Vittoria's relationship to Pole, which has been strikingly underexamined in favor of her far more celebrated, and in many ways actually much less complex relationship to Michelangelo. This will in the broadest sense be a biographical talk meant to bring into focus the extraordinary attachment Vittoria had to the English cardinal and its role in rescuing her from what she described as a state of spiritual unrest, and what her doctor actually described as a disease of the mind. But a secondary purpose of my talk, and one whose ramifications extend beyond the particular context of Pole, is to make a strong case for Vittoria's letters as literary documents. Out of print, as Virginia referred to, out of print since the late 1880s and used almost exclusively for biographical evidence, Vittoria's letters, rather like her relationship to Pole, have been overlooked as a textual corpus rich in metaphor, affect, and expressive power. In the letters to Pol that I'll be describing, Vittoria's voice is strikingly different from what we find in most of her poems. In the letters, she expresses fears, desires, and fantasies that were perhaps less compatible with or less easily kept in check by the 14-line sonnet. There is much, therefore, to be learned about Vittoria's sensibility, both as a person and as an author, in the letters that were her most abiding, constant form of writing. Vittoria Colonna met Reginald Pole around the time of his appointment to the papal curia in 1536. Pope Paul supposedly consulted with her about his choice of new cardinals. This is not entirely documented. Evidence of their first meeting has not survived. Wherever it was that Vittoria came to know Pole personally, he impressed her immediately as a deeply spiritual being. In a letter to Marguerite de Navarre, written in February 1540, Vittoria described the lofty conversations she and Pole had together and declared that he was, quote, always in the heavens, and only for the needs of others does he look to and bother with this earth. This account of Pole, for anyone who knows his biography, does not entirely square with a life spent maneuvering between factions in England and Italy and surviving plot after plot against him. It's a very complicated story, but after refusing to support Henry VIII's divorce, Pole had fled to Padova and soon became a powerful figure in the Roman Church. The complex politics that characterized his life were obviously not apparent or not of interest, however, to Vittoria. Whatever their prior history had been, the relationship between Vittoria and Pole intensified in the summer of 1541, following the Salt Wars, when Pole made an extraordinary gesture to Vittoria. He asked her, she was 10 years his senior, he asked her to become his new mother. Pole's real mother, Margaret Plantagenet, Countess of Salisbury, had met a horrific end earlier that spring at the hands of Henry VIII, largely in retaliation for the acts of her sons. Not only Reginald, but his two brothers were working from within England to depose the king. Margaret was beheaded in May outside the Tower of London. When the news of Margaret's death reached Pole, he was hiding away in the remote town of Capranica in the north of Lazio. According to his secretary and first biographer, Ludovico Beccadalli, Pole reacted to the news by withdrawing into his study for an hour and then emerged cheerfully in good humor, declaring that he was lucky to be the son of a martyr. A few months later, Pole approached Vittoria to take Margaret's place. This was first proposed in response to a letter Vittoria sent him in August 1541, which, like so many letters, has not survived, but Pole refers to it in his response to hers. And this is, I'll read the English, this is the third passage in Italian. It is fitting that your excellence do so, you whom I have always revered, after recognizing in your virtues the highest gifts of God, and especially now, since Pharaoh's madness has ripped away from me, my own mother, I accept you in her place. Not like the woman whose son Moses later denied being, although she was the daughter of the Pharaoh, but like the woman whom, if you should undertake to care for me, I will surely always be praising, I who seem no less deserted than Moses as an infant, exposed not only to the dangers of the river as he was, but also to those of the land and sea, I who will be received by the daughter of a great king, the same who deserted the Pharaoh and his army. In this rather extraordinary use of the biblical story, Pole casts himself as Moses, the abandoned infant, desperately in need of maternal care, and Vittoria not as the maternal surrogate, Pharaoh's daughter, but as the equivalent of Moses' actual mother, who pretended to be a nursemaid in order to suckle her son. And Henry VIII is repeatedly referred to the Pharaoh in Pole's correspondence. Pole's idea of casting Vittoria as his new mother was not a passing fancy that arose in the immediate aftermath of his loss. In a letter several months later to Antonio Pucci, the governor of Bagnoregio, Pole referred to Vittoria's role as if it were official. Pole says, I cannot omit that the Marchesa of Pescara, my new mother, whom I recently saw at Bagnoregio, has been well served by relatives of your lord. and guess in your name. Word of the new arrangement between Vittoria and Paul circulated widely among their friends. In a letter sent to Vittoria in the fall of 1541, Pietro Bembo referred to Paul as your little boy, vostro figliolo. At first, Vittoria seems to have embraced the idea of assuming a maternal relationship to Paul. There was, of course, a real poignancy to this. As a childless woman, she seems to have welcomed the opportunity to occupy the role of mother, however artificial the relationship may have been. We see her trying out the part, as it were, in her only letter to Paul that survives from the summer of 1541. She began by apologizing to him for bothering him with her worthless ramblings, and then begged him to accept what she, as his mother, could give him. This is passage 4. If your lordship is truly want to say, in the words of St. Paul, that it is better to give than to receive, allow me this blessedness, and allow yourself to be deprived of the desire to be more blessed than your mother. Given that St. Paul says it is the parents who should give to their children, and not the children to parents. No sooner, however, did she declare her desire to be the generous maternal one, to give rather than receive, then she asked him to acknowledge her great indebtedness to him. And believe, she continues, this is number 5, that I am extremely obligated to you, both for spiritual things and for worldly things, which in my great exile and need, you of all people have given me and consoled me and helped me and accommodated me, and I kiss your hands. This mention of Vittoria's exile is one of her only acknowledgments of the suffering she endured in the aftermath of the Salt War's devastating losses. It is the only occasion, in fact, where we glimpse her attachment to the Colonna properties as her true home, and to the convent as perhaps only a temporary dwelling. Perhaps she felt that Paul, himself in exile from England, understood what it felt like to be unmoored in this way. But even more important than the idea of exile in this letter is her expression of feeling extremely obligated, estremamente obbligata. With this phrase, the pretense of her being in loco parentis in relation to Paul fell away, and the desperate emotional dependence she seems already to have felt, this was even before she followed him to Viterbo, came flooding over her. However much she wanted to be Paul's mother, she inevitably ended up as his child. As she candidly put it in a letter to their mutual friend, Bishop Giovanni Morone, who was one of the central members of the group in Viterbo, she wrote to Morone, I confess to your lordship that I was never so obliged to anyone as I am to Paul. What did Vittoria mean by this sense of obligation? One of the earliest and most revealing explanations came in a letter she sent in the fall of 1541, just soon after she arrived in Viterbo, to Giulia Gonzaga, the disciple of the reformer Juan de Valdez and the widow of Vittoria's cousin Vespasiano Colonna. In that letter, she wrote that she owed to Paul, quote, the health of both my soul and my body, whereby the one for superstition, the other for bad governance. So the soul for superstition, the body for bad governance, were in terrible danger. According to Pietro Carnesecchi, another member of Paul's circle at Viterbo, who testified about Vittoria before the Inquisition some 20 years later, and he was specifically asked, they had the letter that she wrote to Giulia Gonzaga, he was specifically asked about the superstition. They were worried about that. Carnesecchi says, this is passage 6, the Lady Marchesa, before she took up a friendship with the cardinal, afflicted herself so much with fasting, hair shirts, and other types of mortifications of the flesh that she was reduced almost to skin and bones. And she did all this perhaps by putting too much faith in such works, imagining that in these lay true piety and religiosity, and consequently the salvation of her soul. Fasts, hair shirts, mortification of the flesh, these were practices that Paolo Giovo had already described Vittoria's partaking in with too much enthusiasm on Ischia in 1527 and 1528. It's possible Vittoria had never given these practices up. It's also possible that she resumed her strict bodily penitence in times of turmoil and sadness. Carnesecchi explained that Vittoria had come to change her ways while she was in Viterbo thanks to Pole's intervention. And this is passage 7. But once she was admonished by the cardinal that by using such austerity and rigor against her body, she was actually offending God more than anything else, the above-mentioned lady began to withdraw from such an austere life, slowly scaling herself down to a reasonable and honest middle ground. What Carnesecchi described with detachment in his testimony in the 1560s comes to life in Vittoria's own writing. In a letter to Morone written in December of either 1542 or 43, the year is not included, Vittoria exclaims, and this is passage 8, "Every word of my Monsignor Pole is, I won't say the law that reduces the spirit into servitude, but an infallible rule which liberates me to go along the straight path. If on this truest subject, which is so dear to me, I could have expounded, your magnificence would have seen the chaos of ignorance in which I used to dwell, and the labyrinth of errors where I used to walk in safety, in which I believed that I walked safely, dressed in that gold light that flashes without holding up to the comparison of true faith." Before knowing Pole, Vittoria explains, she lived in a state of chaos, she walked in a labyrinth of errors, she was bathed in a false aura of gold. My body, she continues, this is number 9, was continually moving to find inner tranquility, and my mind was in constant agitation, trying to find peace. And God willed me that Pole address me, saying, "Fiat lux," let there be light, which showed me that I was nothing, and that in Christ I would find everything. This is, in effect, a salvation narrative. Vittoria was lost and then found, with Pole in the role of savior. Vittoria's certainty in the spiritual nature of her ties to Pole made her entirely insensitive to and defensive about any possible romantic or erotic interpretation of her attachment. Pole's companion, Alvise Priuli, however, saw it otherwise and was clearly irritated, if not threatened, by Vittoria's attachment to his friend. And the two of them were almost certainly lovers. They spent their lives together. They asked for joint burial together. There's lots of evidence to suggest this was a romantic partnership between Priuli and Pole. In a letter Vittoria sent to Priuli in the spring of 43, she defended herself against his accusation that she was too physically drawn to Pole, passage 10. "As concerns my too famous flesh that you all speak about, that is, that I have too much affection for such a spirit of God, which according to you can never be a temptation, I have never experienced people saying that is a sign of good, nor have people ever said a consolatory word. In fact, they manage to find every way of disparaging this, such that now I endlessly thank our most reverend Monsignor Pole, who, in writing about this to others, has made me understand that it is not an error, for if it were error and temptation, her attachment to him, his compassion would never have permitted him to declare it a sign of good." With Pole, she went on, quote, "The matter is so perfect, my affection so just and pleasing to God, that I further practice my faith by being as directly receptive to God as Pole is." How exactly Pole produced such strong feelings of Vittoria remains something of a mystery. He was neither a powerful preacher like Ochino, nor a brilliant artist like Michelangelo. There were no sermons or paintings to move her. But Vittoria seemed to crave the company of Pole more than anyone she had ever known. In July 1543, a month or two after she defended herself to Priuli, she wrote Pole a long letter in which she tried to explain the reasons for her devotion to him. This is passage 11. "The Lord knows that I don't desire excessively to speak with you, but for the fact that I perceive in him, in God, an order of spirit which only the spirit senses, and which pulls me up to that fullness of light, so that it does not let me wallow too long in my own misery, but rather with such high and substantial ideas, it shows me the greatness up there and this baseness and lowness here below." The closer I, through his grace, walk towards him, she continues, the more I need to speak to you. Not out of anxiety or doubts or any worries that I might have or fear to have through his goodness, but, she says, because every time your lordship speaks of that stupendous sacrifice of eternal election, of being rewarded and of what was hidden and of what was hidden being found on those mountains, gates, and fountains, it makes my soul soar with its wings, sure that it is flying to the desired nest. It makes my soul soar, she says. In all of Vittoria's writings, poetry, and prose, very little, if anything, approaches the mysticism, almost ecstatic mysticism of this letter. Nowhere else did she describe her sensation of her spirit soaring, her recognition of the smallness of this world compared to the heavens, her perception of the brilliant radiance surrounding the divine. This kind of visionary rapture was what Pohl unleashed in her. At the end of this letter, she declared, this is number 13, for me, speaking with you is like speaking with an intimate friend of my groom, of Christ, who readies me through this medium and calls me to him and wills that I engage in discussions to spark and console me. Vittoria may have stared at Michelangelo's drawings of Christ for hours at a time, but at least as she describes it here, the closest she came to experiencing Christ's presence on earth was when she found herself in the company of Pohl. Sometime the following year, in early 1544, Vittoria sent Pohl another letter, in part responding to further concerns she had about Priuli, which she began the letter by complaining about. Priuli, she claimed, had actually chased her away from visiting Pohl in person. It seemed to him, Vittoria remarked rather bitterly, it seemed to him to take 1,000 years before he could get me to leave in order to protect you from the bother of a woman's visits. She reassured herself, however, that her ties to Pohl could never be severed by mere physical distance. This is passage 14. I find in every way that this is the greatest truth, what you have written to me, namely that we don't need to have our own place in this world. And in this regard, I thank God, who saw fit to use your lordship to set me the happiest place, reach through my faith, at your right hand, like a shoot of that true vine, which alone is sweet-smelling and dear. The we that she uses here, that we don't have to have our own place, is ambiguous. It's responding to something Pohl said in a letter, in this case, of his that's lost. But whoever she included in the we, the inquisitor who later read Vittoria's letters, in part of a different story, in the 1560s, and commented on them, underlined and commented on a bunch of Vittoria's letters to Pohl, he concluded that this particular sentiment smacked of heresy. If it's true that we don't have a permanent citizenship in this world, the inquisitor wrote, nonetheless, not to have a place of her own belongs only to the religiosi, that she had no right to say this, he says. And he says that she's adopting the doctrine of the Waldensians, that is the early 12th century sort of proto-Protestants. The inquisitor also found fault in this letter with Vittoria's assertion that God's having placed her at Pohl's side like a shoot of that true vine. He thought that, as he puts it, smacked of her certainty of her receiving grace, that she was too confident in her salvation. Whatever its potential heretical content, for Vittoria, the metaphor of the shoot of the vine, of her emerging out of or being grafted onto Pohl, is meant to convey how unnatural a division Priuli proposes and how contrary her separation is to the will of God. What is missing for her, however, is Pohl's own consent to her dependence, his willingness to adopt Vittoria not as his mother, but in effect as his child. This is passage 15. If I could truly feel, she continues, that your only delight is to provide me with justice and wisdom and sanctification and redemption, I would not only be consoled in my wandering, even if the journey were full of thorns, but I would also have such a guarantee of the joy awaiting me at the port that I would feel as if I were already on the path to peace and not only on the path to hope. The verb she uses for her wandering, she says, I would not only be consoled in my wandering, is peregrinare. She imagines herself as a spiritual pilgrim who needs assurance that Pole will be waiting for at the desired, promised end. For this reason, she concludes, she simply cannot abide their separation. This is 16. Since I cannot smell from far away the sweet smell of Christ born in your lordship's voice, even if the mind has quieted the anxiety of its outer ills, my desires have grown through the nearer hope for my inner wellness. The odd synesthesia of imagining the smell or scent of Pole's voice speaks, I think, to the all-encompassing nature of her longing for proximity, a longing that ultimately lies in her desire for her own inner wellness, which she calls il mio bene interiore. For someone whose language was consistently decorous and restrained, this letter stands out as exceptional. That Vittoria's feelings for Pole far overwhelmed anything he had imagined when he asked her to be his mother is palpably clear. She sent him lengthy letters. He answered with curt replies. 2 letters I've had from you, she wrote in August 1543, adopting the tone of a jilted lover, which I must say was miraculous, more so to someone who did not know how brief they are, and that they are responses to many, many letters of mine. In letters to Morone, who had accompanied Pole to Trent, Vittoria complained about her loneliness in Viterbo, confiding that she felt alone, cold, and unwell. Io sola, fredda e inferma. Her only comfort, she said, came from the certainty that you and Pole pray to God for me, and that Pole considers my matters worthy of aiding. There are 2 letters written to Pole in the last year of her life that have survived and reveal that even when she was most confident about her spiritual health, her dependence on Pole did not abate. The first was written on Christmas, 1545, so 13, 14 months before her death. She says, quote, I desire nothing in this world that has to do with this world, and I lack nothing in my assurance of enjoying the world to come. This was, needless to say, another sentence highlighted by the inquisitor of smacking of Lutheran certainty, right, that she lacks nothing in her assurance of the world to come. And yet, she says, despite this confidence, she still confesses to a longing for Pole. I lack only your reverend, she says. I desire only you. This combination of lack and desire is immediately put in the context of Pole's role as her spiritual guide. This is passage 17. I lack only your reverend. I desire only you, because you continually helped me to know myself, to humble myself, to reduce myself to nothing, and live only in he who is our every good consolation, joy, and happiness. In the second of these letters, written 6 months later, in July 1546, she affirmed both her state of consolation and her continued dependence on Pole. She says, now I go to Christ entirely sure and consoled, and I seem to your lordship with that divine goodness, entirely one with your most upright will, and that my perhaps excessive willingness needed you. That Pole recognized the extravagant nature of Vittoria's love and his own lack of reciprocal feelings for her surfaces very clearly in the last letter he wrote to her, or at least the last that has survived. Dated October 4th, 1546, so 4 months before her death, the letter reads like an apology and perhaps also a justification for the ways that he had failed her. He begins by recounting a conversation he recently had at Bembo's house, where he received a visit from a fellow Englishman, George Lilly. Lilly had just come from Rome, where he'd spent some time from Vittoria, who had talked to him, no surprise, about her attachment to Pole. No sooner, this is passage 19, no sooner had Lilly arrived here, he reported, than he tired himself out in his first talk with me in vehemently trying to make me understand how heartily your excellence, you Vittoria, how heartily you wish me well. And as if there were something new and already known in this, I let him go on as long as he liked, which was a long time, awaiting the conclusion he might draw from this. Although Lilly did not reproach Pole directly for his failure to love Vittoria, Pole made this point himself, passage 20. If this conclusion had been, which it deserved to be, that drawing a comparison between my behavior and your great and more than motherly love, to condemn me for such ingratitude, the conclusion had been to condemn me for such ingratitude, I certainly would have taken pleasure in such a just reproof. More than motherly love, più che materno amore, the phrase is an intriguing one and suggests that Paul was well aware that the title of mother did not fully accommodate the range of Vittoria's feelings. He continued, but as he, Lily, didn't conclude thus, I will draw this conclusion myself, and so much the more to my embarrassment, as I feel myself to have erred greatly in this, and not even to have set myself to correct the error, although I can't say I haven't worked hard to do that, which I know I ought to do, but finding by experience that I can't succeed as I would like, I let it go, as if God had deprived me of that grace of being able to satisfy my mind in that thing which I so much desire to do, which in truth sometimes gives me much trouble. For Paul to say it was as if God had deprived me of that grace, come se Dio mi privasse di questa grazia, that God deprived him of the grace of loving Vittoria, for him to wish that he could have returned her affection, this was the most honest confession he ever made to her. He had tried to love her, and he had failed. Paul ends the letter by asking for her pardon for my shortcomings. This is the official end of the correspondence and of the relationship between Paul and Vittoria. The next mention of her in his letters comes 10 days after her death, when he writes to a friend that he was, quote, oppressed by pain from the death of the most illustrious Vittoria Colonna. Vittoria, for her part, reified her love for Paul in the extraordinary bequest she made him in her last will and testament, where she gave him the bulk of her estate, 9,000 scudi, much to her brother Ascanio's dismay. The fate of this bequest is a long and complicated story that I won't go into here, but it's meaningful that Vittoria chose to leave her wealth not to a member of her own family, but to someone to whom she had no official ties, but who seems to have meant more to her than anyone else ever had. Vittoria stopped writing poems, it seems, around the time of her move to Viterbo, and therefore around the time that she developed her intimate relationship with Paul. In her letters to and about him, however, we find the expression of a mingled spirituality and eros that exceeds the boundaries of her sonnets. Thank you.
Thank you for this paper that has delved in depth into this puzzling relationship, also a puzzling figure, that of Reginald Paul, pretty puzzling man. And I think we can open the floor to questions. Se ci sono domande anche in italiano, ovviamente vanno benissimo.
Thank you both for starting us off with such fascinating papers. My question is for Ramie. I love this idea of looking at the letters not just as biographical but as literary documents. And I was particularly struck by citation 17, where she says, mi manca solo lei desidero, because that, of course, has this, it just smacks of this Petrarchan language, this sort of, the separation and the longing. And it had me thinking about, Braden has written about, for example, Bembo's letters to Maria Savoyan and the way that Petrarchan language leaks into their prose letters. And I was wondering to what extent you're finding that in Colonna's letters.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I would say that the letters to Paul probably have quite a lot of the longing, the absence, that io sola, fredda, da so, that kind of rhetoric is very much that of an abandoned lover. The particular metaphors that she uses, though, tend to be more spiritual and mystical in that particular correspondence, I think. So I would say that she's borrowing on a sort of religious vocabulary that comes from a whole bunch of different places. But you're absolutely right, and I do think, it's funny that they keep insisting on the mother-child, because there are a lot of other ways to look at it, but certainly lovers is one. Because Priuli was so clearly Paul's lover from everything I can gather, what actually was going on between them is not, I don't have details, but Vittoria really felt very threatened by Priuli and vice versa. And so there's a lot of the triangulation, maybe more Dante there than of the sort of extra lover in the way. And so you will find that kind of resentment and feeling that she's been displaced in the letters with Priuli.
Thank you both. My question is also for Ramie. I really appreciated this more earthly sort of presentation of Vittoria Colonna's relationship to Paul. And I find the image or the theme of motherhood really interesting in light of the letters to Marguerite de Navarre, where we have this partorire nello spirito, and this idea, this double idea of being birthed in the spirit at the same time as sort of fulfilling this maternal role. Do you find anything else? Have you come across anything else along that theme of sort of spiritual motherhood in her correspondence, or?
What's interesting is, I mean, it's a really nice observation. What's interesting is that the first time the metaphor of motherhood comes up, it's in the early sonnets where she describes that she gave birth to Ferrante's fame, right? And so even though we were sterile, she says we were fecund, we were fertile in producing your glory. And then it sort of disappears for a long time. And then you're right that we have it there. What's really interesting is I think that she never liked particularly this metaphorical relationship to Paul, or she loses it very quickly. I don't think she feels spiritually adatta to this. But in the letters to Costanza, the published, which are the other obvious, super hyper mystical, there, I think you could find some of this, and I can't conjure them up. Maybe Abby knows them better. But I do think there she actually starts to explore certainly very female metaphors of the spirit and of its engendering capacity. But I think with Paul, it's always this repetition of obligation, indebtedness, of dependence rather than maternal capacity.
To stay with the motherhood theme, because I was going to ask about, because there is the sonnet addressed to Paul in which Colonna styles herself as his second mother. She does that before Margaret Pole dies. So presumably so I had always interpreted it that she generates that role for herself as a way of getting him hooked, rather than him offering it to her and her then kind of going well beyond the confines of what he was offering. It's like she sees that as an opportunity almost, and that predates the letter, I think. It must do, because
that's helpful because it makes sense of the letter that we have. He seems to be assenting. He says it's fitting, or my translation is, it's fitting that your excellence do so, you whom I've always admired. So it's as if she has said something in her letter to suggest that, but maybe it was just from the sonnet.
I wonder if it was the poem rather than a preceding letter, because the timing is quite close, I imagine.
Yes.
But it would be interesting then if she's generating that role as an appropriate way to forge a spiritual friendship with Paul, even though she then becomes very inappropriate, as you.
Yes. Yeah. No. Thank you. That is really interesting, and it makes a lot of sense of why he frames it that way.
And sort of sticking with some of the stuff that's been said, and going back to the citations. 17 and the question of like Petrarchan language seeping in. I mean, it's a really, that passage 17, but also elsewhere throughout, there was a really fascinating like inversion of the lover-beloved thing. I mean, in 12, she says, far sta l'anima sulle ali, sicura di volar al desiderato nido. And this is, leali d'amore is one of these things that Petrarch is always talking about, right? And then Boccaccio picks up certain things that are happening, especially from the Petrarch Canzoniere 360 onward, where Petrarch is talking about how loving Lauda allows him to reach his full potential, right?
Yes.
It's like, it allows me to become a better version of myself. And Boccaccio actually uses a kind of weird turn of phrase that I cannot remember it right now, but I can find it later. But it's all about in a language of self-help, it's about self-realization and actualization, right? And here, she goes in the exact opposite direction, right? Mi aiutava a conoscere, here we're in 17, right? A conoscere me stesso. Okay, so we're with Petrarch and Boccaccio. Ad umiliarmi, a starmi quasi costretta andar in questa via di annichilarmi. I mean, it's self-abnegation, it's self-destruction. It is this is like Petrarch flying too close to the flame and just like bursting into flame, right? And it's a kind of interesting inversion of that Petrarchan topos into a language of reformed spirituality that is about like, you find yourself through flagellation, you find yourself through like all of those things that are talked about in the Carnesecchi testimony,
yeah.
that you know, are in so many ways revealed here, like as an incredibly subtle reader of Petrarch, but looking at the absolute opposite side of that dialectic of love.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think Petrarch would never want to say these things about himself. But if you think about Petrarch's self-defense in The Secret, for example, when, you know, Augustine is accusing him of instrumentalizing Lara for his own career, and he says, you know, no, that brings me closer to God. But you're absolutely right that this is what we could call sort of a Lutheran turn, this abjection and reduction always to nothingness, and that is consistent. So there's a tension, as I think your comment suggests, between the soaring above, but then this constant, you know, self-denial and in keeping with these practices, which were clearly going on. It's Paul, when the famous physician, what's his name, Fracastora, who cured syphilis, when that physician comes to see Vittoria, he throws his hands up and he says, you know, it's like Lady Macbeth's physician. He says, I can't help her, that she's suffering from a disease of the mind. And he says, the only person who can help her is Reginald Pole. That's what he says. She needs Pole to come in. So, you know, that's really where she was. I mean, the dates here are very, very close because this was in August, and I think Margaret was beheaded in May. So there's time enough. Oh, yeah, she was in prison for a long time. She was beheaded in May. In prigione, okay. Yeah, she was in prison for a while. Certainly letters enclosing poems were, you know, I mean, Vittoria sent lots of, you know, poems inside her letters to Bembo, and she easily could have done that. And that would make a lot of sense of his. He's clearly responding to her letter. Maybe he's just responding to the poem itself.
As the role of her poetry, because when you enclose a poem in a letter, you send it to a poet who responds with a poem. But if you enclose a poem in a letter to Paul, he's not going to respond by writing you a poem. So what is the function of the poem then in the letter? If that were the case, it would seem to me to make of her poem for him something rather more active and and sort of reactive than just a Petrarchan poem in its.
It is really interesting also if one, depending on the date of the poem, this was also exactly the moment in those last couple months when she sent the Pope 2 poems as a political intervention. So the way she tried to stop the salt wars, Giovanna Colonna did as well, Ascanio's Giovanna Regona, or Colonna, depending on where we think the divorce was at that point. But she actually sent Paul 2 sonnets about the bloody Colonna fields. And we don't have a letter in which that was enclosed, which it might have been, but one could imagine this was a period in which she was using the poems as a kind of instrument for communication, rather different from how we usually see her using them.
Yeah, I looked back at the sonnet, you know, trying to sort of look for clues, and it's extraordinarily striking how beautifully controlled the language of the sonnet is compared to this, with these letters, which really bore out your point. And I was wondering how much that sonnet was circulating and almost kind of making public this construction of her as his second mother, even during the time of Margaret Pole's lifetime.
Which maybe would explain Bembo's referring to it so quickly as well.
I have a question about this complexity and multi-layered type of language with suggestions from Petrarchan style. But how much of the language and the style, also the ambiguity of the language that sometimes you can detect, especially in Paul's letter to Vittoria, very convoluted type of writing. How much can you detect also of the prudence that these people were using in communicating with each other, especially the letter by Paul is 1546, so the Roman Inquisition had been already revamped by Gian Pietro Carafa, so things were changing and they had to be more prudent. And also in the language of Vittoria, in her way of conceiving her religious relationship of motherhood or on the contrary, filiolanza to Paul, how much can you detect of the influence of Juan de Valdez? So the influence of the Alumbrados movement that was so powerful in a group of the Ecclesia Viterbienses. We know that was one of the hooks that Paul had used with Giovanni Morone on their trip to Trento, when Morone, according to Carnesecchi, became much more available to receive the ideas of the Reformation than before. How much do you think this also applied to Vittoria, the influence of the Alumbrados religiosity?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. In that letter that she sent to Julia Gonzaga, the occasion for that letter was she was requesting that Julia send her a book of Valdez's commentaries on the epistles of St. Paul. And she says, I, of all people, need them most. I need Valdez's wisdom. And given her attachment to Occhino, who was spoon-fed sermons by Valdez, Valdez was outlining sermons for Occhino, I think that, there's a lot to be said for Vittoria's dependence on Valdez. How much that plays into her particular attachment to Paul, I don't know, but it is the case that, Occhino goes into, flees Italy exactly at the moment that Paul comes in. So there's a sort of replacement of one spiritual leader with another, and that's all happening in this very moment, in the fall of 1541 to 42. So one could see Paul as the sort of new Occhino Valdesian figure in her life, although Paul was very careful, as you also suggest. This was a moment when things were, the noose was starting to tighten, obviously, in terms of, Trent and the Inquisition taking up. And Paul, we have to remember, lost the papacy by 2 votes in 1549. So he came very close to becoming, he's the only person who almost became Pope and subsequently became Archbishop of Canterbury. And I mean, he had an extraordinary career. So I do think that he was being careful. That said, I see nothing careful in Vittoria's letters to Paul. I mean, the extravagant expressions of spiritual dependence. And when you look, as I have spent time in the Inquisition archive, in the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome, the censors underline, the things that the Inquisition found most objectionable about Vittoria were all in her letters to Paul. A few letters to Marguerite, but mostly it's the letters to Paul that he has a problem with.
I was very intrigued by this, as you said, Ramie, this with Bernardino Occhino, and because I was wondering this. For me, it's not Petrarchan rhetoric. It's Franciscan rhetoric.
Yes.
It's a spiritual rhetoric,
yes.
And which is also, of course, Petrarch used a lot. So that is why we
yes.
recognize it in a way.
Yes.
This spiritual journey, this Peregrinus ubique and everything. But this is really rooted in the Franciscan spirituality, and I was wondering, because just as you said now that. Reginald Paul, he just came after, or the Bernardino Occhino, the meeting Bernardino Occhino, and maybe this is a way to maybe wish to revive this spirit, this Franciscan spirituality, which is also many political connections or connotations. So I was wondering, is this something she wants to maybe to bring with her to Reginald Paul, to instruct him in a way, what she has brought from this year's this conversation with Bernardino?
It's a really interesting idea. She was one of the great supporters of the Cappuccini,
yes, I know
and
that.
I mean not just of Occhino, but of the order. And in the basically theological treatise she wrote defending the Cappuccini in the guise of a letter to Contarini, she wrote a 12-page letter defending them. She espouses all of the Franciscan, and she actually says there, if St. Francis is a Lutheran, then we're all heretics. So she actually, denies wants to push away from a Lutheran sort of heretical label on the Franciscans. So she's trying to carve out a spiritual heritage that would be protected precisely from what she's anticipating as the Lutheran attack, which does come. So your first point I think is really important, that what seems Petrarchan often is coming out of a spiritual tradition that goes back to the Franciscans, and it's not strictly secular or erotic, but precisely spiritual. And it is, as I said before, just overwhelmingly. I don't like the separation of erotic and spiritual, and that's one of the things I'm trying to say, that I think a lot of Umberto and I were talking about that last night, a lot of the the rime amorose are saturated with spiritual language and vice versa, but what feels very erotic is also very spiritual. I mean, so they're coming from the same tradition. It's not, there's no neat division, I would say.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on the element of Valdez and the possible influence. And where I would see it in the influence of Illuminismo is in the pneumatology and the role of the Holy Spirit. And I think two words that I found to come up in those letters among the spirituali are strumento and mosso, or mossa, and this idea of guidance and being moved. And I think in one of the letters, I'm not sure if it was to Paul or from Paul, there's this idea, there's a veiled biblical reference to the amicus sponsi as one who stands and listens and hears sort of Christ and is a vehicle in that way. So I think I would see it in that inspired guidance, that element, as perhaps sort of coming from that tradition in some sense, modified for the religious letter and for poetry.
Could I just ask a quick question to Shulamit? I was really interested in the way that you were drawing this comparison between Pontano and Colonna as leaders of these two cenacoli, and I wondered how we might think about the fact that she had this shared leadership. To what extent do you find that they are sort of treated each as the leader when it's convenient or appropriate, or is one thing that they're modeling, in addition to a cenacolo with women and a cenacolo with the vernacular, is one thing that they're modeling kind of a co-leadership?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's part of a post-Pontano new model of leadership. As I was saying, in the post-Pontano Accademia Pontaniana, we already see this co-leadership. I mean, I was attracted to, the first thought was, oh, this is a very feminine thing. But the truth is that they do it already. We see a parallel type of co-leadership in Naples, and which is very interesting. So one is given the title of the host, and the other given the title of the head of but when it's clear that maybe what people think exactly that, but I mean, for example, when Sannazaro is hosting people at his home, it is clear that he is in some way continuing Pontano, and he is, but there is this type of sharing, and so I in some way felt that there was this this model is also seen on Ischia.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I think I had this instinct also to sort of over-gender it maybe, and I was thinking about some of the language in the letters to Marguerite Navarre, but I like this link that you're making to other male models that they would have had more regionally as well.
Well, if we don't have questions, I think the schedule is that we break up for lunch and reconvene at 2, correct? Thank you.